The rain fell in fits and starts, like it couldn't decide whether to commit to a downpour or just give up and let the clouds sag. Jack Harper stood under the awning of his apartment building, the damp chill creeping through the soles of his work boots. He tugged at the collar of his button-up shirt, his only clean one, ironed with a towel and an old iron that sparked when he plugged it in. The shirt was second-hand, a faint checkered pattern, the kind of thing you'd find in a thrift store bin for $3. He'd checked it twice for stains before putting it on. His hands, rough from years of wrenches and grease, still carried faint smudges under the nails despite the half-hour he'd spent scrubbing them raw. Beside him, Emma clutched a small, glittery purse she'd made herself from a craft kit last Christmas. Her dress was lavender, another thrift store find. Its hem carefully mended by Jack the night before with needle and thread he'd borrowed from a neighbor. Her hair was pulled into 2 neat braids, each tied with a ribbon she'd picked out, herself. At 10 years old, Emma was all bright eyes and quiet hope, her small frame vibrating with the kind of excitement that only a birthday could bring. She'd been talking about this night for weeks, ever since Jack had promised her something special. "You look like a princess," he said, crouching to meet her eyes. His voice was soft, the way it always was when he wanted her to feel safe. Emma grinned, twirling so the dress flared slightly. "Do I really? Really?" He stood, brushing a speck of lint from her shoulder. "Ready to go, kiddo?" She nodded, clutching her purse tighter. Jack opened the passenger door of their faded blue sedan, its paint chipped from years of Midwest winters. The car smelled faintly of motor oil and the peppermint air freshener Emma had hung on the rearview mirror. As she climbed in, Jack glanced, up at the sky, gray and heavy, smearing the horizon like a watercolor left out in the rain. He hoped it wasn't an omen. The drive to the city took 30 minutes, the radio crackling with a country station that kept cutting out. Emma hummed along, her voice small but steady, filling the car with a warmth that made Jack's chest ache. He'd been saving for this night for months, tucking away every spare dollar from brake jobs and oil changes at the garage. The Golden Oak wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place people in their small town of Ellison, Ohio whispered about. A city gem, all polished wood and candlelight, where reservations were booked weeks in advance and the menu didn't list prices. Jack had called 3 times to confirm their spot, speaking to a woman named Lisa who'd been kind enough to squeeze them in for Emma's 10th birthday. He wanted her to feel like the world could be magical, even if just for one night. Emma deserved that. She deserved chandeliers and fancy napkins and a moment where she wasn't just the kid of a single dad who counted quarters for laundry. She deserved to feel like a princess. The city loomed ahead, its skyline a mix of old brick and new glass, the lights blurred by the drizzle. Jack parked a block away from the Golden Oak, the closest spot he could find without paying for a lot. He didn't mind the walk, but he held Emma's hand tightly as they navigated the wet sidewalk, her small fingers warm against his calloused palm. The restaurant's sign glowed above the entrance, gold script curling against a dark green awning. It looked like a place from a movie, not a place for people like them. "You nervous?" Emma asked, looking up at him as they reached the door. Jack forced a smile. "Me? Nah, I'm just here to make sure you don't order the whole dessert menu." She giggled, and the sound was enough to loosen the knot in his stomach, if only for a moment. He pushed open the heavy glass door, and the warmth of the restaurant hit them like a wave. The air smelled of roasted herbs and expensive wine, the kind of scents that didn't exist in their world of instant coffee and microwave dinners. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light across tables draped in white linen, where patrons in tailored suits and silk dresses murmured over plates of food that looked more like art than dinner. Waiters moved like ghosts, their black vests crisp, their steps silent on the polished hardwood floor. Jack guided Emma toward the front desk, his hand light on her shoulder. She was staring at everything. The flickering candles, the gleaming silverware, the way the light caught the edge of a wine glass like it was a diamond. Her eyes were wide, her purse clutched to her chest like a shield. Jack felt a pang of pride mixed with something sharper, something like fear. He tugged at his shirt again, suddenly aware of how thin the fabric was, how the cuffs were fraying just enough to notice if you looked too close. The maitre d' stood behind a sleek podium, his suit sharper than anything Jack had ever owned. His name tag read, Elliot, and his smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. He looked up as they approached, his gaze sweeping over Jack's thrift store shirt, Emma's simple dress, and back to Jack's unshaven jaw. The pause was brief but heavy, like he was cataloging every flaw. "Good evening," Elliot said, his voice smooth but edged with something cool. "Can I help you?" Jack straightened, his hand still on Emma's shoulder. "We have a reservation. Harper for 2, 7 o'clock. Elliot's eyes flicked to the leather-bound book in front of him. He opened it, scanned a page, then snapped it shut with a precision that felt like a verdict. "I'm afraid there's no record of that," he said, his tone clipped. "There must be some mistake." Jack's brow furrowed. "I called 3 days ago. Spoke to someone named Lisa. She confirmed it." "Lisa no longer works here," Elliot replied, his smile tightening. "And even if she did, we have a strict dress code." He let the words hang, each one landing like a pebble in still water. His gaze lingered on Jack's boots, scuffed but polished, then on Emma's dress, which suddenly looked too simple, too small for the grandeur of the room. Jack felt the heat creeping up his neck, but he kept his voice steady for Emma's sake. "I checked the dress code when I called. We're not in jeans or sneakers. We're here to celebrate my daughter's birthday." Emma looked up at him, her smile faltering, but still there, like she was trying to hold on to the magic she'd been promised. She didn't understand yet, not fully, but Jack did. He knew that look, that tone. It was the same one he'd gotten at the bank when he applied for a loan he couldn't qualify for, or at the school parent-teacher night when he showed up in his work jacket. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." "There must be some way to fix this," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We drove all the way from Ellison. It's her 10th birthday." Elliot leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a syrupy condescension. "I understand it's a special occasion, sir, but we're at full capacity tonight. And frankly, even if your name were in the book, which it isn't, I'm afraid we cannot seat guests who don't meet our standards." The word standards hit like a slap. Emma's hand tightened in Jack's, and she looked up at him, her voice small. "Did we do something wrong, Daddy?" The question cut deeper than anything Elliot could have said. Jack crouched to her level, forcing a smile that felt like lifting a car with his bare hands. "No, sweetheart. You're perfect. You look beautiful, and you did everything right." Behind them, a woman in a red dress laughed softly, not cruelly, but enough to make Jack's skin prickle. A couple passed by, their eyes sliding over him and Emma like they were scenery, not people. The judgment was quiet, but it was there, crawling over Jack's back like static. He stood, turning back to Elliot, who now wore the expression of someone dealing with a stray dog that had wandered in. "I just wanted one nice night for her," Jack said, his voice low, almost pleading. "That's all. She's 10. It's her birthday." Elliot leaned in. His tone now meant only for Jack, though Emma could still hear. "That's very sweet, sir. But if you want your daughter to enjoy a place like this, perhaps start with somewhere more suited to your circumstances." Jack's hand curled into a fist before he could stop it. For a split second he saw himself grabbing the man's pristine lapel, just enough to shake that smug look off his face. But then Emma tugged at his sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy, it's okay. We can go somewhere else." Her bravery, the way she was trying to protect him, made his throat burn. He blinked hard, swallowing the anger, the shame, the weight of being told, again, that he wasn't enough. "Come on, kiddo," he said softly, turning toward the door. "Let's find another place." But before he could take a step, a voice cut through the hum of the restaurant, sharp and smooth, like a blade dipped in velvet. "Excuse me," it said, calm but unyielding. "I believe you've made a mistake." Every head in the room turned. The clink of silverware stilled, the murmur of conversation faltered, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Jack froze, his hand still on Emma's shoulder, and turned to see who had spoken. She stood at a corner table, a woman in a deep emerald dress that caught the chandelier light like a forest under moonlight. Her hair was swept into a loose knot, her posture straight but not stiff, exuding a quiet authority that made the room feel smaller. She wasn't just beautiful, she was commanding, the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her eyes locked on Elliot, and for the first time the maitre d' looked unsteady. "Miss Bennet," Elliot stammered, his composure slipping. I was just—" "You were just turning away a father and his daughter," she said, her voice steady, cutting through his excuse like glass. "I was watching, and I'd like to clarify something. You turned them away because you decided they didn't look the part." Elliot straightened, grasping for control. "I was merely following policy, Miss Bennet. Our dress code—" "Your policy," she interrupted, her tone flat but sharp, "seems to prioritize appearances over decency. I saw a father trying to give his daughter a special night, and a little girl who looks like she belongs in a storybook. What I didn't see was a reason to humiliate them." The room was silent now, the kind of silence that made every breath feel loud. Jack stood rooted, his heart pounding, unsure whether to feel grateful or exposed. Emma's hand tightened in his, her eyes wide, not with fear anymore, but with something like wonder. "Please," the woman continued, turning to Jack, her voice softening but still firm. "Won't you join me? My table has plenty of room." Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. The floor felt unsteady, like someone had pulled the world out from under him. "We don't want to intrude," he said quietly, his instinct to shield. Emma from more embarrassment kicking in. "It's not an intrusion," she replied, her eyes steady. "It would be an honor." Elliot stood frozen, caught between protocol and the weight of her presence. She gave him a look, not angry, but expectant, the kind that made it clear she wasn't asking. Without another word, he stepped aside, his face tight with something like defeat. Jack hesitated, glancing down at Emma. Her face was glowing now, the earlier hurt fading under the promise of something new. "Okay," he said, his voice low, still uncertain. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," the woman said, a small smile breaking through. "Now come. No little girl should feel small on her birthday." She turned, leading them through the restaurant, her steps deliberate, her presence parting the crowd like water. Jack followed, Emma's hand in his, feeling the eyes of the other patrons, some curious, some judgmental, some ashamed for staying silent. The air crackled with the shift, the kind that follows when power moves in a room. They reached a round table in the corner, draped in cream linen, a single candle flickering in the center. The plates were delicate, the napkins folded like origami, and the chandelier above cast a warm glow that made Emma's dress look almost magical. "Here," the woman said, pulling out a chair for Emma. "This seat is for the birthday girl." Emma hesitated, looking to Jack. He nodded, and she slid into the chair, sitting up straighter, as if trying to match the elegance around her. Jack took the seat across from her, his hands stiff in his lap, his heart still racing. The woman sat, last unhurried, as if the entire scene hadn't just upended the room. "Thank you," Jack said finally, his voice quiet but raw. "You didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed, her eyes meeting his. "But someone did." She reached for the water glass, her movements graceful but not performative. "Claire Bennet," she said, extending a hand across the table. "Jack Harper," he replied, shaking it lightly, his rough palm brushing against her smooth one. It felt like touching a different world. A waiter appeared almost instantly, his demeanor warmer than Elliot's, as if Claire's presence had rewritten the rules. "We'll start with sparkling water," Claire said, glancing at Emma with a smile, "and a Shirley Temple, extra cherries for the guest of honor." Emma's face lit up, her fingers toying with the edge of her napkin. The waiter nodded and retreated, and Claire turned back to Jack. "I know what it's like to be told you don't belong in a place like this," she said, her voice quieter now, almost like she was speaking to herself. "But I also know what it means when someone holds the door open." Jack looked at Emma, who was now sipping her Shirley Temple through a striped straw, her eyes wide with delight. Something in his chest shifted. Not relief exactly, but the faint stir of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or the possibility that tonight could still be what he'd promised her. Emma's Shirley Temple sat in front of her, the pink liquid glowing under the chandelier light, a tiny umbrella perched like a crown among the extra cherries Claire had ordered. She sipped it slowly, her eyes wide, as if afraid the drink might vanish if she moved too fast. Jack watched her from across the table, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the knot still tightening in his chest. The restaurant, the Golden Oak, hummed around them. Soft jazz weaving through the murmur of conversation, the clink of wine glasses, the occasional laugh that felt too polished to be real. The air smelled of roasted garlic and something floral, maybe the fresh lilies on every table. It was a world Jack had only glimpsed through car windows or TV screens, and now here he was, sitting in it, feeling like an imposter who'd been handed a temporary pass. Claire leaned forward slightly, her emerald dress catching the light as she pointed to the menu in Emma's hands. "What do you think, birthday girl? The pasta with the little flowers looks fun, doesn't it? They're edible, you know." Emma's brows shot up, her fingers pausing on the napkin she'd been fidgeting with. "You can eat flowers." Her voice was bright, curious, the earlier hurt from the maitre d's rejection fading under the glow of this new adventure. "You can?" Claire said, her smile warm but not patronizing. "They taste a little like herbs but sweeter." "Want to try them?" Emma nodded eagerly, then glanced at Jack as if checking for permission. He gave her a small nod, his throat tight. He was still reeling from Claire's intervention, the way she'd turned the room's attention without raising her voice, the way she'd made them feel seen instead of small. He wanted to thank her again, but the words felt heavy, like they'd come out tangled with too much gratitude, too much need. Instead, he sat quietly, his hands clasped in his lap, the calluses on his fingers brushing against the soft linen tablecloth. The waiter returned, a younger man with a kinder face than Elliot's, his vest still crisp but his smile genuine. "Ready to order?" he asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. Claire took the lead, glancing at Emma first. "The birthday girl will have the pasta with edible flowers and a side of the roasted vegetables. For me, the seared scallops, please." She looked at Jack, her eyes soft but expectant. "And for you?" Jack hesitated, his eyes scanning the menu, the words blurred together. Confit, reduction, foie gras. Terms he didn't know and prices he couldn't see but could feel pressing against him. He'd planned to order the cheapest thing, maybe a salad, to keep the bill manageable. But with Claire watching, her gaze steady and unjudging, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. The desire to belong, even if just for tonight. "I'll take the steak," he said finally, his voice quieter than he meant. "Medium, please." The waiter nodded and disappeared, leaving the three of them in a pocket of quiet amidst the restaurant's hum. Emma was still staring at her drink, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "This is the fanciest place I've ever been," she said, almost to herself. "It's like a castle." Jack's chest ached at her words. He'd wanted this for her, this moment of awe, but he hadn't expected it to come at the cost of that scene at the door. He glanced at Claire, who was watching Emma with a softness that made him uneasy. Not because it wasn't genuine, but because it was. He wasn't used to kindness without strings. "You've got a good eye," Claire said to Emma. "This place does feel a bit like a castle, but you know what makes a castle special? The people inside it." Emma tilted her head, her braids swinging slightly. "Like knights and princesses?" "Exactly," Claire said, leaning in conspiratorially. "And tonight you're the princess. So tell me, what's your favorite thing about being 10? Emma's face lit up, and she launched into a story about her school project, a model of the solar system she'd made with ping-pong balls and a coat hanger. Jack listened, half smiling, as her words tumbled out, her hands gesturing wildly. Claire didn't just nod along. She asked questions, real ones, about why Emma picked blue for Jupiter, and whether she thought aliens might live on Mars. It was the kind of attention Emma rarely got from anyone but Jack, and it hit him harder than he expected. He'd spent years being her everything, her protector, her cheerleader, her mechanic when her bike chain snapped. Seeing someone else step into that space, even for a moment, felt like relief and loss all at once. "You're good with her," Jack said, quietly, when Emma paused to sip her drink. Claire's eyes flicked to his, a flicker of surprise in them before she smiled. She's easy to be good with. She's got a spark, like she's going to take on the world someday. Jack looked at Emma, who was now folding her napkin, into a clumsy origami shape, her tongue poking out in concentration. She's the reason I keep going, he said, almost to himself. Always has been. Claire nodded, her gaze softening. I can see that. It's not easy, doing it alone. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Jack shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the stem of his water glass. We manage, he said, his tone clipped, not because he was angry, but because he wasn't used to being seen so clearly. Not by a stranger, and definitely not by someone like Claire, someone who belonged in this world of chandeliers and $50 plates. The food arrived, a parade of dishes that looked like they belonged in a museum. Emma's pasta was studded with tiny purple and yellow flowers, each petal delicate enough to make her gasp. Jack's steak was a perfect circle, drizzled with a sauce that shimmered like it had been painted on. Claire's scallops were arranged in a fan, each one glistening under the candlelight. Emma stared at her plate, then at Jack, her eyes wide with something between excitement and disbelief. Go ahead, kiddo, Jack said, his voice softer now. Try it. Emma speared a flower with her fork, inspecting it like a scientist before, popping it into her mouth. Her face lit up and she giggled. It tastes like grass, but sweet. Claire laughed, a sound that was warm and unforced. That's a perfect description. You're a food critic already. Jack cut into his steak, the knife sliding through it like it was butter. He took a bite, and for a moment, he forgot the weight of the night, the maître d' sneer, the eyes of the other patrons, the way his shirt felt too thin for this room. The food was better than anything he'd tasted, rich and layered, like it carried stories he'd never know. But even as he ate, that knot in his chest refused to loosen. He kept waiting for the catch, for the moment this fairy tale would crack and reveal the reality underneath. You're quiet, Claire said, her voice low enough that Emma, now engrossed in her pasta, didn't hear. Jack glanced at her, then down at his plate. Just taking it all in. This isn't my kind of place. It could be, she said, not as a challenge, but as a quiet observation. You're here now. He shook his head slightly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I'm here because of you. If you hadn't stepped in, we'd be eating drive-thrus. Burgers right now. Claire set her fork down, her eyes steady on his. And would that have been so bad? Emma's smiling either way. Jack looked at his daughter, who was now twirling a strand of pasta around her fork, humming softly to herself. She was happy, radiant even, and it made his heart ache in a way he couldn't name. She deserves better than drive-thru, he said finally. But places like this, they don't let people like us in. Not really. Claire's expression shifted, a shadow passing over her face. I know what that's like, she said, her voice quieter now, almost like she was sharing a secret. Growing up, I was the kid in the hand-me-down coat, standing outside places like this, watching people who looked like they owned the world. I promised myself I'd get inside one day, not just to eat, but to belong. Jack studied her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him, elegant, poised, every inch at home in this glittering room, with the image of a kid in a worn coat. You don't look like someone who's ever been on the outside, he said, not unkindly, but with a trace of doubt. Her smile was small, tinged with something bittersweet. I've worked hard to make sure of that. But I remember every door that closed in my face, every look that said I wasn't enough. That's why I couldn't sit there and watch it happen to you. Jack didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to argue, to tell her he didn't need saving, that he and Emma were fine on their own. But the truth was, he wasn't sure they were. Not tonight, not when Emma's face had crumpled at the maitre d's words, not when he'd felt the weight of every eye in the room judging them. Claire hadn't just given them a table, She'd given them a shield, a moment to breathe without shame. The conversation paused as the waiter brought a dessert menu, and Emma's eyes lit up at the mention of a chocolate torte with gold flakes. "Gold?" she whispered, looking at Claire. "Like real gold?" "Not quite," Claire said, her smile returning. "But it looks like treasure, doesn't it? Let's get one for the table." Emma clapped her hands and Jack felt a pang of unease. He'd been running the math in his head all night, calculating what he could afford, what he'd have to stretch, to cover. The steak alone was probably more than he spent on groceries in a week. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You don't have to do that. I know you can," Claire said, cutting him off gently. "But let me." For her. Jack's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to insist he could handle it. But the way Emma was looking at the dessert menu, her face glowing with anticipation, stopped him. He nodded once, a reluctant surrender, and Claire signaled the waiter. The torte arrived, a dark, chocolate dome dusted with gold flakes that shimmered under the candlelight. Emma gasped, her spoon hovering over it like she was afraid to ruin the perfection. "It's like something from a movie," she said, her voice hushed. "Then dig in, princess," Claire said, handing her a spoon. "Movies are meant to be enjoyed." Emma took a tentative bite, her eyes widening as the chocolate melted on her tongue. "Daddy, you have to try this," she said, pushing the plate toward him. Jack took a small bite, the richness almost overwhelming. It was good. Too good, like it belonged to someone else's life. He glanced at Claire, who was watching them both with a quiet satisfaction. "You're spoiling her," he said, half joking, half serious. "Maybe," Claire admitted. "But every kid deserves to be spoiled on their birthday." The rest of the meal passed in a blur of small moments. Emma's laughter, Claire's stories about her own childhood, a summer job at a diner, a prom dress she'd sewn herself, Jack's cautious smiles as he let himself relax just a little. But the knot in his chest never fully loosened. He kept waiting for the bill, for the moment when the magic would break and reality would crash back in. He'd brought his debit card and a small stack of crumpled bills, hoping it would be enough. But he knew it wouldn't be. Not here. When the waiter returned, Jack braced himself, his hand already reaching for his wallet. But the waiter didn't bring a leather folder or a slip of paper. He simply smiled at Claire, gave a slight nod, and walked away. Jack stared at the empty space on the table, his brows pulling together. "You paid already?" he asked, his voice low, edged with something he couldn't name. Claire took a final sip of her wine, setting the glass down with a soft clink. "I did." Jack leaned forward, his tone firm, but quiet. "I was going to cover what I could. I didn't bring us here to have someone else foot the bill." "I know you didn't," Claire said, her voice calm, steady. "That's exactly why I wanted to." Emma was still licking chocolate from her spoon, oblivious to the tension. Jack's pride tangled with his gratitude, choking his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell her he didn't need charity, that he wasn't some project to be fixed. But the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with something like respect, made the words stick. "It's not that I'm ungrateful," he said finally, his voice softer now. "It's just, I'm not used to being the one who gets rescued." Claire met his gaze, unflinching. "Then maybe it's time someone did." The words landed heavier than anything else she'd said all night. Not because they were harsh, but because they were gentle, delivered with a quiet certainty that made Jack feel seen in a way he wasn't prepared for. Emma let out a dramatic sigh, breaking the moment. "I don't want to leave," she said, her spoon clinking against the empty torte plate. Jack smiled, brushing a crumb from her cheek. "It's getting late, kiddo." Claire stood, smoothing her dress. "I'll have my driver bring the car around. I'd be happy to give you both a ride." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Emma's eyes lit up so brightly he stopped himself. "A real driver?" she asked, her voice full of awe. "The realest," Claire said, winking. "Come on, let's get you home." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Just this once. They walked toward the exit together, Claire leading the way with that same effortless grace. The maitre d', Elliot, was nowhere in sight, but the memory of his sneer still burned in Jack's mind. This time, though, he didn't feel the weight of it as heavily. Emma's laughter, Claire's steady presence, the warmth of the night, they carried him forward. As they stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sharp, the city lights reflecting in puddles on the sidewalk. The car was waiting, a sleek black sedan that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The driver, a quiet man, in a dark suit, opened the door and Emma gasped. "Is this a spaceship?" she whispered, climbing in like she was stepping onto a throne. Jack chuckled, following her more slowly, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The interior was all soft leather and polished wood, the kind of luxury that made his sedan feel like a cardboard box. Claire slid in beside them, her presence grounding despite the opulence. The door shut, muffling the city's noise, and the car hummed to life, gliding away from the curb. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice neutral. Jack hesitated, his pride flaring again. He didn't want Claire to see the cracked sidewalks and flickering porch lights of his neighborhood. "Just the corner of Maple and 12th, he said. "We'll walk from there." Claire raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She gave the driver a small nod, and the car moved through the city, the lights blurring into streaks of gold and neon. Emma sat between them, her legs swinging, her head resting against Jack's arm. She was relaxed, completely at ease, her earlier fears forgotten. Jack could feel the warmth of her small body, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and it steadied him too. "You're a mechanic, right?" Claire asked, breaking the silence. Jack glanced at her, surprised by the shift. "Yeah, small garage out by the train tracks in Ellison. Been there 7 years." "Do you own it?" she asked, her tone curious but not probing. He laughed quietly, a dry sound. "I barely own my toolbox. It's my boss's place. I do whatever comes in. Brake jobs, diagnostics, a lot of patchwork these days." "You're good at it?" she asked, her eyes steady on his. Jack shrugged. "I keep cars on the road. People who can't afford dealerships come to me." Claire nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a skill, one that doesn't get enough respect." He studied her for a moment, trying to figure out her angle. "You always ride around saving mechanics from rude maitre d's?" Her smile was faint, almost self-deprecating. "Only the ones who teach their daughters to hold their heads high, even when the world tries to knock them down." Jack didn't know how to respond to that. He turned his face toward the window, the city lights washing over his features. It had been a long time since someone saw something in him worth noticing, something beyond the grease stains and the late bills. The car slowed at the corner of Maple and 12th, where the city's shine faded into the worn edges of Ellison. Brick, buildings with chipped paint, streetlights that flickered more than they glowed. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, just forgotten, the kind of place where kids played in parking lots because the parks were too far and the sidewalks were too cracked. The driver turned his head. "Here, sir." Jack glanced at Emma, now dozing, lightly against his arm, her lavender dress wrinkled, her braids loose from the night's excitement. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to step out into the cold and break the spell of this night. Claire was watching him, her silence, patient, intentional. "We can walk from here," Jack said quietly. "I don't want her seeing where we live and thinking we don't belong in places like the one you took us to tonight." Claire's brow furrowed just slightly. What if she saw where she lived and still believed she belonged everywhere? Jack looked away, his jaw tight. Kids don't hold on to fairy tales forever. Sooner or later, the world teaches them the truth. And maybe, Claire said, her voice soft but firm, that's why they need people who show them a different truth while they're still young enough to believe it. The engine idled, a low hum filling the silence. Jack gently shifted Emma, sliding out of the seat with her in his arms. She stirred but didn't wake, her hand curling against his chest like it used to when she was a toddler. Claire stepped out too, her heels clicking softly on the wet pavement. She stood there completely out of place in her elegant dress, but she didn't flinch, didn't look uncomfortable. She just watched them, like she belonged there with them. I don't usually let people in, Jack said, adjusting Emma's. Wait, too many don't know how to stay. I'm not most people, Claire replied, her voice steady. He nodded once, then, almost reluctantly, said, You want to walk us to the door? Claire's smile was small, but genuine. I'd like that. They walked the short distance to Jack's apartment building, the hallway smelling of old wood and cheap floor polish. The fluorescent lights buzzed, one flickering like it was on its last legs. Jack unlocked the door, nudging it open with his shoulder while balancing Emma. Sorry, he muttered as they stepped inside. It's not much. The living room was small, the couch sagging under a quilt Jack's mom had made years ago. A shelf held Emma's coloring books and a few of her drawings taped to the wall, stick figures of her and Jack, a car with a smiling hood, a sun with rays like eyelashes. A coat rack made from old wrenches stood by the door, a project Jack had welded together when Emma was 5. Claire stepped in, her heels soft on the worn linoleum. She didn't wrinkle her nose or glance around with polite discomfort. Instead, she turned slowly, taking in the space. Not the lack of luxury, but the signs of life. You built this, she said, almost to herself. Jack carried Emma to her bedroom, a tiny space painted sky blue with glow-in-the-dark stars still clinging to the ceiling. He laid her gently on the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She murmured something in her sleep, her hand reaching out, and he caught it, brushing her fingers before stepping away. When he returned, Claire was standing by the wall of drawings, her eyes on one in particular. A stick figure of Jack with a wrench, Emma beside him, both under a smiling sun. Me and Daddy at the shop, she read aloud, her voice soft. She loves you so deeply. Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She's the reason I get up in the morning. You do more than get up, Claire said, turning to face him. You keep going, with everything stacked against you. That's not common, Jack. That's rare. He let out a breath, unsure how to respond to being seen so clearly. It was disarming, like she'd found a crack in the armor he'd spent years building. He moved to the kitchen, more out of habit than need, filling a kettle that whined when it heated. Tea? He asked, his voice rough. Sure, Claire said, following him. She leaned against the doorway, watching him with that same calm gaze. The kitchen was cramped, the counter scarred from years of use, the kettle a relic from a thrift store. Jack set it on the burner, his hands moving on autopilot. He needed something to do, something to keep the moment from swallowing him whole. You're quiet, Claire said gently. Jack ran a hand through his hair, the kettle starting to hum. I'm still trying to figure out what tonight was. A birthday dinner, she said, a playful edge to her voice. He let out a dry laugh, not bitter, just tired. Felt like a rescue mission. You think that's a bad thing? She asked, stepping into the kitchen, closer now. The light above flickered once before settling. I think I've spent too many years teaching myself not to need saving, Jack said, his voice low, honest in a way that scared him. Claire's expression softened, but she didn't look away. Needing help doesn't make you weak, Jack. It just makes you human. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time that night, he saw something beyond the polished exterior. There was a resilience in her eyes, a loneliness that mirrored his own. You ever get tired of pretending you're fine all the time? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Her jaw tensed slightly, her eyes darting down, before meeting his again. Every day. The kettle whistled, a sharp sound that broke the moment. Jack moved to silence it, pouring hot water into 2 mismatched mugs. No honey, no lemon, just plain black tea and the weight of shared exhaustion. He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing for a moment, a brief electric jolt that neither of them acknowledged. Claire held his gaze, her expression unreadable but far from indifferent. You didn't have to let me in tonight, she said. Not here. Not to your home. I didn't, Jack replied, his voice softer now. But something told me I'd regret it if I didn't. The air between them shifted, heavier now, like they were standing on the edge of something neither was ready to name. Jack leaned against the counter, the dim kitchen light casting shadows across his jaw. Claire stood across from him holding the mug she hadn't sipped, her presence steady in a way that made the small space feel bigger. "So, what happens now?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean you don't live in this world." He gestured to the cracked linoleum, the creaky floorboards, the life he'd built from scraps and stubbornness. "This isn't your orbit." "Maybe I don't want to live in an orbit anymore," she said, her voice steady, certain. Jack narrowed, his eyes slightly searching for the catch. "People like you. They don't just fall into people like me." "Is that what you think this is?" Claire asked, stepping closer, her voice softer now. "A fall?" He didn't answer right away, his pride and doubt wrestling in his chest. "I think it's easy to get swept up in a moment," he said finally. "And I think when that moment ends, people go back to their own." Claire stepped forward again, close enough that he could smell the faint citrus of her perfume. "You think I did this because I felt sorry for you?" Jack exhaled through his nose, his hands tightening on the counter. "I don't know why you did it. That's what's got me stuck." Her eyes searched his, steady and unflinching. "Because you didn't ask for anything. Because you held your dignity when they tried to take it. Because your daughter smiled, through it anyway. And because when I saw you, I saw someone who reminds me of myself." Jack looked for anything false in her words, any hint of a script. But all he found was honesty. It scared him more than the maitre d's sneer, more than the weight of the bill he hadn't paid. "I'm not looking for a fairy tale, Claire," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how to do those." "I'm not offering one," she replied. "I'm offering real." The word hung between them, heavy and solid like a stone dropped into still water. Jack looked down at his hands, the faint grease stains he could never fully scrub away. "I don't know if I know how to do real anymore." "Then maybe we start there," Claire said, her voice soft but firm. The air was thick now, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Jack picked up his mug, poured the cold tea into the sink, the splash louder than it should have been in the quiet. He dried his hands on a frayed towel, his back to her, but he could feel her watching, waiting. "I don't know how to let people in without bracing for when they leave," he said, his voice barely audible. Claire's voice came softly behind him. "That's not trust. That's trauma." He turned slowly, her words hitting a nerve he'd spent years ignoring. She was right, and that made it worse. He'd built a life of caution, of measured warmth, letting people close enough to smile but never close enough to stay. "I don't want Emma to grow up thinking this is all life can be," he said. "But I also don't want her to think someone's coming to rescue her. No one ever rescued me." Claire stepped closer, her heels muffled on the tile. "Maybe that's why you became her hero, because you had to fight with no one in your corner." Jack blinked, his throat tight. "And what if I don't know how to be anything else?" "Then we figure it out," she said, "together." The word together landed like a promise, and for the first time that night Jack didn't feel the urge to run. He didn't know what this was, or if it could be anything at all. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. The kitchen. Light flickered again, casting a faint strobe across the chipped linoleum as Jack stood by the sink, his hands still gripping the frayed towel. Claire's words, "Then we figure it out. Together," hung in the air like a melody he wasn't sure he could trust. He wanted to believe her, wanted to lean into the possibility of something real, but years of caution pulled him back. He'd built walls out of necessity, each brick laid with the memory of someone leaving. Emma's mother, friends who faded when life got hard, even his own parents, who'd checked out long before they passed. Trust wasn't just a choice for Jack, it was a gamble, and the stakes were Emma's heart as much as his own. Claire stood across from him, her mug of tea untouched, her eyes steady but not pushing. She seemed to understand the weight of the moment, the way it balanced on a knife's edge between hope and fear. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm not going anywhere." Jack exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half relief. "You say that now," he muttered, but there was no bite in it. He set the towel down, his fingers brushing the counter's worn edge. I keep waiting for the catch. Nobody does what you did tonight without wanting something." Claire tilted her head, her expression unreadable for a moment. "And what do you think I want?" He looked at her, really looked, searching for the answer in her eyes. There was no pity there, no agenda, just a quiet strength that made him feel both seen and exposed. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "That's what scares me." She stepped closer, her heels muffled on the tile, the space between them shrinking. "I don't want anything from you, Jack. Not a favor, not a thank you, not even a promise. I just saw a father trying to give his kid a night she'd never forget. And I saw someone try to take that away. I couldn't sit still." Jack's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell her he didn't need her to fight his battles, but the memory of Emma's face at the restaurant door, small, confused, her hope dimming, stopped him. Claire hadn't just saved the night. She'd saved something deeper, something Jack had been trying to protect for 10 years. "You didn't just give her a dinner," he said finally. "You gave her back her smile." Claire's lips curved, a small, almost shy smile. "She's got a good one, worth fighting for." The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken things. Jack glanced toward the hallway where Emma slept. Her door cracked just enough to let the glow of her star-shaped nightlight spill out. He thought about the bill again, the one Claire had paid without a word, without even letting him see the total. It gnawed at him, not because he wasn't grateful, but because it felt like a debt he couldn't repay. He'd spent years teaching himself to carry his own weight, to never owe anyone anything. Charity, in his experience, always came with strings. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "About the bill." Claire's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Go ahead. Why didn't you let me see it?" He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, not in anger but in defense. "I was ready to pay what I could. I had cash, my card. I wasn't going to let it slide." "I know you weren't," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. "I saw your face when the waiter walked away. You were ready to empty your wallet. Then, why?" His voice was sharper now, the edge of his pride cutting through. "I didn't come there to be your good deed for the day. I don't need rescuing, Claire. Neither does Emma." Claire set her mug down, the soft clink loud in the quiet kitchen. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the faint lines that said she'd carried her own weight too. "You think that's what this was? A good deed?" Her voice was steady, but there was a spark in it, not anger, but conviction. "I didn't pay that bill because I thought you couldn't. I paid it because I wanted to, because I saw a man who'd fought too hard for too long to give his daughter one perfect night. I wasn't rescuing you, Jack. I was standing with you." "They cause." Words hit like a punch he hadn't seen coming. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, his jaw tight. She wasn't wrong, but that didn't make it easier to hear. He'd spent so long being the one who held everything together. Emma's lunches, her school projects, the rent checks that always cleared by the skin of his teeth, that the idea of someone standing with him felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. "I'm not used to that," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "People standing with me." "I know," Claire said, her tone softening. "But you don't have to do it alone anymore." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It wasn't just about the bill or the dinner or even the night. It was about the possibility that someone could see him, really see him, grease stains and all, and still choose to stay. He wanted to believe her, but belief was a muscle he hadn't used in years, and it ached with the effort. Emma stirred. In the next room, a sleepy murmur breaking the silence. Jack glanced toward her door, his instincts kicking in. "I should check on her," he said, moving toward the hallway. Claire nodded, stepping back. I should go. It's late. Jack paused, his hand on the doorframe. He didn't want her to leave, not yet, but he didn't know how to say it without sounding desperate. You don't have to, he said, his voice rough. I mean, you walked us up. Least I can do is walk you out. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. Deal. They stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air cool and sharp with the scent of rain that lingered outside. Jack carried Emma's weight in his mind, her laughter from the night still echoing, but it was Claire's presence beside him that anchored him now. They reached the building's entrance, the glass doors streaked with raindrops, the street beyond quiet except for the occasional car hissing by on wet pavement. Claire's driver was waiting, the sleek black sedan idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the dark. She turned to Jack, her coat draped over her arm, her expression softer now, less guarded. You sure you're okay? She asked, tilting her head. With everything from tonight? Jack gave a slow nod, his hands in his pockets. I'm more okay than I've been in a while, which is new. Her lips curved into something warmer, not quite a smile, but close. Good. He shifted his weight, the cold biting at his knuckles through the thin fabric of his jacket. You didn't have to walk into our night like that, he said. I know, but I'm glad you did. Claire met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them looked away. There was no grand gesture, no cinematic swell of music, just the quiet pulse of something real taking root. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a card, matte black, simple lettering, just her name and number. She held it out to him. Call me, she said, her voice steady. Not because you owe me, but because I'd like to see you again. Jack took the card, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through him. He glanced, down at the card, then back at her. You always make a habit of handing out cards to strangers? Only the ones who don't ask for anything, she said. Those are the ones worth knowing. She stepped toward the car, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. Jack watched as the driver opened the door, her silhouette slipping into the sedan's dark interior. The door closed, the engine hummed, and the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the rain-slicked street. He stood there a moment longer, the card heavy in his hand, the night air sharp against his skin. What the hell just happened? He muttered to no one, then turned and headed back inside, the door creaking shut behind him. The next morning came too early, the gray light of dawn seeping through the apartment's thin curtains. Jack sat at the kitchen table, a cup instantaneous coffee cooling between his hands, the black card Claire had given him resting on the table, like a challenge. He hadn't slept much, his mind replaying the night, the restaurant, the maitre d's sneer, Claire's voice cutting through the tension, Emma's laughter as she ate gold-dusted chocolate. It felt like a dream, one he wasn't sure he deserved to wake up from. Emma shuffled into the kitchen, her pajamas wrinkled, her hair a wild halo of curls. She squinted at him, rubbing sleep from her eyes. You look weird, she said, yawning, mid-sentence. Thanks, Jack said, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Nice to see you too. She climbed onto a chair, eyeing the card on the table. Is that from the fancy lady? Jack's hand paused on his mug. Her name's Claire, he said, his tone softer than he meant. And yeah, it is. You gonna call her? Emma asked, her voice curious but not teasing, like she was sizing up the situation with the seriousness only a 10-year-old could muster. Jack leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, kiddo. Maybe. She was nice, Emma said, reaching for a piece of toast from his plate. She didn't talk to me like I was a baby. He watched her, the way she nibbled at the toast, her braids still loose from the night before. You liked her, huh? Emma shrugged, but her eyes lit up. She made it feel like we belonged there, like we weren't wrong. Jack's chest tightened. He hadn't realized how much Emma had felt the sting of the maitre d's rejection, how deeply it had landed. You're never wrong, he said, his voice firm. Not you. Not ever. She smiled, a small, trusting smile that made him want to be better, stronger, more than the man who'd almost let that night fall apart. He glanced at the card again, its edges already curling slightly from the humidity in the apartment. Part of him wanted to call, to hear Claire's voice again, to see if that spark from last night could survive the cold light of day. But another part, the louder part, warned him not to get too close. People like Claire didn't stay in worlds like his. They had boardrooms, drivers, lives that didn't smell like motor oil and instant coffee. The buzz of the garage door opening downstairs snapped him out of his thoughts. He stood, tucking the card into his wallet behind a photo of Emma in her Halloween costume, a mechanic's jumpsuit, too big for her, with a toy wrench in her hand. He told himself it didn't mean anything, just a place to keep it safe. But he knew better. The garage was alive with its usual chaos when Jack arrived. Engines rumbling, the clank of tools, the faint hum of a radio playing classic rock. The air smelled of oil and metal, a comfort that grounded him after the surreal haze of last night. Benny, the shop owner and Jack's friend since high school, looked up from under the hood of a beat-up pickup. He gave Jack a nod, the kind that said everything without saying anything at all. They didn't do small talk in the mornings, just work, the rhythm of it as familiar as breathing. Jack changed into his coveralls in the back room, the metal zipper a line between last night and today. But even as he reached for his tools, Claire's voice lingered. "I'm offering real." He shook it off, diving into a busted alternator with a focus that usually silenced his thoughts. But today, his rhythm was off. He stripped a bolt, cursed, under his breath and nicked his knuckle on a sharp edge, the sting sharp enough to remind him that fairy tales didn't belong in a garage. By lunch, he'd had enough. He stepped into the alley behind the shop, the cold biting at the sweat on his neck. He lit a cigarette, his first in weeks, and leaned against the brick wall, staring at the cracked pavement. The rain had started again, a light drizzle that matched the storm in his head. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she'd looked at him, not with pity or curiosity, but with recognition, like she saw something worth standing beside. He took a drag, the smoke curling into the damp air. He pulled out his phone, then his wallet, staring at the black card tucked behind Emma's photo. His thumb hovered over the screen, the number already half memorized. He didn't know what he'd say if she answered, didn't know if he could handle the weight of her voice saying she'd been waiting. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. The cigarette burned low between his fingers. He typed her number into his phone, hesitated, then hit call. It rang once, twice, and on the third ring her voice came through warm and steady, like a light cutting through the rain. "Hello?" Jack's breath caught. "It's me," he said. "Jack," a beat passed, then her voice softened. "I was hoping you'd call." And with those 5 words, something inside him shifted, like a gear finally clicking into place. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to find out. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky stayed gray, dragging its heels across Ellison like it wasn't ready to let the sun through. Jack stood in front of the bathroom mirror, a razor in one hand, doubt in the other. He hadn't shaved clean in months, maybe longer. The scruff was part of him now, like the grease under his nails or the worn flannel he threw on most days. It was armor, a way to say he didn't need the world's approval. But today, as he scraped the blade along his jaw, each stroke felt like peeling back a layer of that armor, leaving him sharper, younger, more exposed than he was comfortable with. He wasn't sure why he cared so much. Claire hadn't asked him to be anyone else, but the thought of showing up at the cafe looking like he'd just crawled out from under a car didn't sit right. He rinsed the blade, the water swirling gray in the sink, and studied his reflection. The man staring back looked unfamiliar, his jawline too clean, his eyes too open. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to tame the mess, and muttered, "Get it together, Harper." It wasn't just about the coffee meetup. It was about the card in his wallet, the number he'd called yesterday, the voice on the other end that had said, "I was hoping you'd call." It was about the possibility that he might not screw this up. Emma padded into the kitchen as he poured coffee into a chipped mug, her pajamas still on, her curls a wild halo. She squinted at him, her head tilted. "You look weird," she said, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. Jack chuckled, the sound easing the tension in his chest. Thanks, kiddo. You're a real confidence booster. Are you going on a date? She asked, her tone matter-of-fact, like she was asking if he'd fixed her bike yet. He nearly spilled his coffee, his back stiffening. It's not a date. It's just coffee. With Claire. Emma climbed onto a chair, her eyes narrowing like she was inspecting an engine. You like her, don't you? Jack sat across from her, stirring sugar into his mug just to keep his hands busy. I think I do, he admitted, his voice low. But I'm not sure if I should. Why not? Emma's question was simple, cutting through the layers of doubt he'd built up. He looked at her, 10 years old, and already better at seeing through him than most adults. Because sometimes things that feel good don't stay, he said, the words heavier than he meant them to be. Emma shrugged, unbothered, her mouth full of toast. Sometimes they do. He gave her a long look, her words sinking in. She was right, in her own way. Kids saw the world in possibilities, not probabilities, and maybe that was what he needed to borrow from her today. He stood, kissed the top of her head, and grabbed his jacket. Don't grow up too fast, okay? I won't, she mumbled, already stealing another bite of his toast. Jack checked the mirror one last time, his reflection still foreign, then headed out before he could talk himself out of it. The cafe, Brew and Bean, was a 15-minute drive from Ellison, tucked into a corner of the city where the buildings were less polished, more lived in. It was nothing like the Golden Oak, no chandeliers, no velvet booths, just the hum of conversation, the hiss of milk frothing, and the smell of cinnamon drifting from a tray of pastries behind the counter. The tables were mismatched wood, the ID chairs scuffed but sturdy, and the patrons were a mix of college kids, retirees, and moms with strollers. It was the kind of place where nobody cared if your shirt was thrifted, and Jack liked that. He arrived early, claiming a table by the window, his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug he hadn't touched. His eyes flicked to the door every time. It opened, a woman with a laptop, a guy in a knit cap, a couple arguing over a phone. None of them were her. He checked his phone, then his watch, then his phone again, the seconds ticking heavier than they should. Maybe she wouldn't show. Maybe she'd thought better of it, realized a mechanic from Ellison wasn't worth the gas money to get here. He pushed the thought down, but it lingered, sharp and familiar. Then the door opened, and there she was. Claire moved with the same quiet confidence she'd had at the restaurant, but today she was stripped of the elegance that had made her seem untouchable. No emerald dress, no heels, just jeans, a slate gray coat, and a scarf loosely draped around her neck. Her hair was down, catching the light in soft waves, and somehow she still looked like the most composed person in the room. Jack stood as she approached, his movements awkward, like he wasn't sure of the rules in this new setting. She smiled, and the tension in his shoulders melted, just a little. I wasn't sure you'd show, he said, his voice betraying a hint of the doubt he'd been wrestling with. I told you I would, Claire said simply, sliding into the chair across from him. Her words carried a weight, like her promises weren't made lightly. The barista came by and Claire ordered a cappuccino, her voice calm, unhurried. Jack ordered another coffee, mostly to have something to hold on to. They made small talk at first, the weather, still gray, Emma's solar system project. She'd added glitter to Saturn's rings. The garage's latest headache, a transmission that refused to cooperate. But Jack could feel something heavier brewing beneath the surface, something that wasn't about coffee or small talk. Claire set her cup down, her fingers tracing the rim. I've been thinking about you, she said, her voice low, direct. The words landed like a spark, catching Jack off guard. He looked down at his mug, his thumbs pressing into the ceramic. That's dangerous, he said, half joking, but the truth in it made his chest tight. Maybe, she said, her eyes steady on his, but I don't regret it. He met her gaze, really met it, and saw no game, no pretense, just two people in a quiet cafe trying to figure out if what they'd felt in the heat of that restaurant night could hold up in the cold light of day. I don't know what you want from me, he said finally, his voice low, raw. I fix cars, Claire. I don't throw dinner parties or talk stocks or drink wine that doesn't come in a box. She leaned back slightly, not retreating, but giving him space to breathe. You think that's why I'm here? She asked, her tone gentle but pointed. He didn't answer, his silence an answer in itself. Claire let it sit, but not long enough to fester. I've been around people with money, power, influence, she said, her voice steady. They fill rooms with noise and never say anything real. But you… She paused, choosing her words carefully. You didn't try to impress me. You didn't ask for anything. That night, when everything could have broken you in front of Emma, you stood tall. That's rare, Jack. That's real. Her words hit him harder than he expected, peeling back the armor he'd spent years reinforcing. He'd built a life out of being the guy who didn't need anyone, who didn't ask for help, who didn't expect the world to give him a break. But Claire saw through it, saw him, and it made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if he'd fall or fly. You make it sound like I'm something special, he said, his voice rough, a half smirk masking the vulnerability. I'm just a guy trying to keep the lights on. You're not just anything, Claire said, her tone firm but soft. You're flawed, stubborn, maybe a little too guarded. But you're real, Jack. You don't pretend, and I don't have to pretend around you. That's worth more than any boardroom or bottle of wine. He swallowed hard, her words sinking deep, stirring something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of something more than survival. Complicated's all I've got, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then maybe I've been looking in the wrong places, Claire replied, her eyes never leaving. The cafe hummed around them, the clink of mugs and the murmur of voices fading into the background. Jack leaned back, exhaling through his nose, fighting the storm in his chest. He wanted to believe this wasn't a fleeting moment, that it could be something stronger, something worth building. But belief came with risk, and risk wasn't something he took lightly. The walk back to his truck was quiet, not uncomfortable but full, like the silence carried more than words could. Claire walked beside him, her hands in her coat pockets, her hair catching the wind in soft strands. Jack kept glancing at her, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was afraid speaking would break the fragile balance they'd found. They reached his truck, parked under a bare oak tree, its branches casting jagged shadows across the chipped paint and cracked side mirror. It was the opposite of Claire's sleek sedan, a relic of his world, practical and worn. He turned. To her, one hand on the door handle, the sunlight glinting off the windshield in a cold glare. You sure you're not slumming it? He asked, half joking. But the question carried the weight of his doubt. Claire didn't smile. She stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to breath and intention. Don't insult what this is, she said quietly. And don't insult yourself. The words knocked something loose in him, a piece of the armor he'd been clinging to. He'd spent so long bracing for rejection, wearing it like a shield, that her presence, steady, unflinching, felt like a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. You ever feel like the world's got two doors? He asked suddenly. One for people like you, one for people like me? Claire shook her head, her scarf slipping slightly. The world didn't build those doors. People did. And people can tear them down. Her conviction was quiet but unshakable, and it unnerved him more than it comforted him, because it meant he had a choice, a risk. You scare the hell out of me, he said, the honesty slipping out before he could stop it. Good, she replied, no hesitation. Because you scare me too. Then she leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek, not rushed or flirtatious, but solid, like a promise. The warmth of it lingered, a quiet jolt that made his breath catch. I'll call you, she said, stepping back, her eyes holding his for a moment longer. Or you call me. Either way, we're not done. Jack watched her walk away, her footsteps fading on the sidewalk, her scarf trailing slightly in the wind. For once, he didn't feel left behind. He felt chosen. The next week unfolded like any other on the surface. Jack woke early, packed Emma's lunch, dropped her at school, and spent his days at the garage, hands deep in engines. But beneath the grease and routine, something had shifted. He checked his phone more than he cared to admit, half expecting a text from Claire, half dreading the silence. She hadn't called yet, and he hadn't called her either. It wasn't a game. It was fear dressed as patience. Part of him thought she was giving him space. The other part wondered if she'd realized their worlds were too far apart, that kindness didn't always mean staying. By Thursday, the doubt was louder, creeping in between oil changes and tire rotations. He was pacing the garage, tools untouched, when Benny caught him staring at his phone. "You look like a man trying not to do something stupid," Benny said, wiping grease from his hands. Jack smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking." "Thinking too long's what gets you in trouble," Benny said, his voice gruff but kind. "Whatever it is, you either want it or you don't. Don't sit on the fence, it'll break under you." Jack gave a half laugh. "You calling me heavy?" "I'm calling you scared," Benny said, clapping him on the shoulder before disappearing under a hood. The words stuck, sharp and true. That evening, as Jack locked up the garage, the door creaked open, and his breath caught. Claire stood in the doorway, her black coat simple, her hair pulled back, no trace of the polished woman from the restaurant. She looked more herself, raw and real, like she'd stepped out of her world and into his without hesitation. "You said you'd call," Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag, his heart racing. "I know," Claire said, stepping inside, the scent of oil and metal wrapping around her. "But I thought this would say more." He didn't speak right away, his hand still moving over the rag, smearing more grease than he wiped away. "I've been thinking," she continued, her voice steady, "about what happens when people from different worlds collide. How easy it is to assume they'll just bounce off and keep moving." Jack nodded slowly, "because they usually do." "But I don't want to," she said, her eyes locking on his. "I want to see what happens if we stop bouncing and start building." He looked down, then back at her, his voice low. "You sure you're ready for what comes with me? It's not glamorous." "I'm not looking for glamorous," Claire said. "I'm looking for honest." Jack took a slow breath, the kind that felt like surrender and acceptance rolled into one. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, and said quietly, "Then let's build." The garage was quiet, the hum of the radio long silenced, the only sound the faint drip of rain outside. Claire smiled, a small, steady curve of her lips, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't brace for the moment she'd leave. He braced for the moment she'd stay.